Okay, I figured out how to unmute. I thought it was star. It's star six. How about that? Can everybody hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now. Perfect.
Great. Okay, so apologize for that. Thanks for having me talk to you about bumblebees, something I love to talk about. And it is nice to look out the window and see all this snow and think about a time where it's probably not so nasty and cold. We can think about bumblebees. I'm kind of ill right now. It just happened last night, so I'm under a blanket and covered in sweatshirt and all that. So bear with me if I don't know what's wrong with me, but we'll see. But I'll talk to you about bumblebees until I quit. How about that? I'm going to describe some, well, let's see if I can get my screens to work here. Okay. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the work that we do in my lab at the University of Illinois. I work on a couple different service contracts to different governmental entities where we provide, at the Natural History Survey, we provide expertise on, basically the ecology of the state. And that's important for management, conservation, and regulatory and permitting, and also, general theoretical science at times. So we do a lot of things at the Natural History Survey. I came here as a postdoc in my previous life. I guess it's not previous, I still do it, but I was very interested in aquatic insects. I did a PhD at University of Tennessee on stoneflies and caddisflies and mayflies and all of these wonderful places in the southeastern mountains, the central Appalachians. And I came here to work on species modeling, distributions, and immediately thought, what have I done? Illinois is brown and flat and muddy. But but doing this work, I have learned that there are many beautiful places in this state, and there are many beautiful things that are left here. And that is a thrill to me because I love places as much as I love things. So I will start telling you first about some of the folks that are working on this project with me. That's me in the middle, and on my right, on your left, is my master's student, Maria Repachak, and on my left, your right, in the blue, is another entomologist on another project, Erica Bilger. And this is Team Bombus. This is what I call these pictures. This is the insect collection manager at the university, at the Natural History Survey. This is Dr. Tommy McElrath in his native environment. We are out on the boardwalk at Volo Bog messing around while we were looking for some rare bumblebees that have been reported there about 100 years ago and no one's ever seen since in Illinois. And my other master's student is Alma Shragi. She's there with the camera. I'm not really going to talk about the scientific work that they've been doing today. I thought this group seemed like they were more interested in naturalist type questions and how to tell things apart and where to look for them and all the fun facts about bumblebees and bumblebee research that we can talk about rather than getting into p-values. So I'm going to skip a lot of the stuff that she's talking about, but I will tell you briefly. Alma's working on detection probability methods to better refine our attempts to go survey a site for the bumblebee species that are there. In other words, how hard do we need to look? How can we be certain that we haven't missed something? What do our abundance measures truly tell us? Because they vary with lots of things. And Maria has worked for me since she's an undergrad. She and I are collaborating on a wildlife grant to inventory the insect assemblages in what will eventually become a new state park and other classes of DNR properties in LaSalle County. That area is called Lone Star. It's adjacent and near the Starved Rock corridor. So there's lots of cool things down there. We found some really stuff. She's interested in bumblebees. That's part of her project, but she's also, she's into the aquatics like I am. There are many sponsors at the Natural History Survey that fund our work, and here are my main three. Basically, is DOT, the Department of Transportation. About half of my support comes from DOT. I do stream water quality assessments for benthic macroinvertebrates. I look for endangered species of insects like bumblebees or Heinz emerald dragonfly. We do those in potential road corridors, and a lot of the rusty patch stuff is up in y'all's neighborhood, so I'm there quite frequently throughout the summer. The other sponsor, I work on the Tollway Authority, and they also have the dubious honor of managing this enormous network, transportation network, right in the middle of the stronghold of the remaining Rusty Patch Bumblebee sites in Illinois. So we have been supported by both of those entities on several different interlocking, intersecting type things, and then also DNR for the SWIG. So what I will tell you today, hopefully we'll get through all of this, but you know, when I give a talk like this, I like to just overload on slides and we'll see what we can do, because I'd rather have too many than not enough. I will describe to you some of the basic biology of bumblebees, and these things are far weirder than you might imagine. Maybe you do know something about them, but it's a very fascinating story when you consider how some of these life history traits and cycles interact with our ability to detect them on the landscape. So that's what I'm very interested in. But in order to really get an idea of who's out there and what they're doing and all that, we need to know historical patterns of who was out there and what were they doing. And so I'll talk to you some about our insect collection holdings and how they relate to bumblebee patterns of bumblebee distributions in the state. And then I'm going to talk about the hero, Rusty Patch Bumblebee, and a little bit about it, because I thought I could talk to you a lot about, there's a lot of information about Rusty Patch out there. I'll tell you some of it, but I think it's also good to identify the others. And one thing that makes you confident that you're looking at a Rusty Patch is that you know it's not one of the others. And although you all mostly live in an area where you are very likely to encounter a Rusty Patch Bumblebee, they're still usually quite rare on the landscape. So maybe you're in a nice spot where there is a nest nearby or something like that. It's helpful to know that that is not this and not this and not this and not this. Therefore, I should be thinking about these other species. A process of elimination. So bees, bumblebees in particular, but bees, ants, sawflies, and wasps in general form the insect order Hymenoptera. And one way that, this is not a foolproof way, but one way to identify Hymenopteran insects is they have the first abdominal segment is constricted, and it's different ways across different groups, but in some insect orders sort of mimic this. But that's a typical thing. If you think about having an ant has a big old butt, that's the sort of thing that bees and wasps generally have also. The winged venation in these insects is very reduced compared to many other orders like moths and butterflies and Neuroptera especially. The antennae of bees and wasps and ants and sawflies are often elbowed or bent. And these are insects that have a complete metamorphosis in their life cycle. They go from egg to larva to pupa to winged adult. And many insects don't do that. They're hemimetabolists. They go from egg to nymphs to bigger nymphs to bigger nymphs to bigger nymphs to one day, voila, they have wings and they look just like they did in their last nymph stage. The holometabolous insects completely restructure their entire body plan during these life history changes, these phase changes. That's a very cool thing. Now, what is a bumblebee? One of my favorite things, I guess all my students roll their eyes because they've heard it before, but Edward Abbey, a personal hero, was a writer, an American environmental writer. And he was a park ranger and interacted with the public as little as possible. But when he did, he liked to be sardonic and wry. And some tourists came up to him while he was standing there, and a big raven was eating a piece of bread that they had fed it against the rules, and said, "What is that?" And he says, "What it is, madam, no man knows, but some call it a bumblebee," or some call it a raven, I'm sorry. So what is a bumblebee? Well, I don't know. But we distinguish them by many features. And one of the best ones, if you get one in your hand, you have a microscope or you have it on a pen or something. I don't recommend holding bumblebees in your hand, although I will tell you how to do it. The hind wing is lacking a particular lobe in the anal region of the wing that is called a jugal lobe. Boy, that's not much of a character to hang a identification on, right? You probably have the perspective of, I don't know, Antonin Scalia. He knows it when he sees it, right? You know a bumblebee when you see it. So they're generally hairy, they're black and yellow, but they can be white or brown, have these kinds of things on them. And you've probably looked at carpenter bees, which look like them, and thought that looks off. What's off about that? And some of the features that they're just bumblebees are hairy and carpenter bees aren't that hairy. Males are stingless. They often have a yellow hairs on their face, and you can catch them and impress all your friends, or see how long you can stand to hold a buzzing bumblebee cupped in your hands without your fear overwhelming you and you releasing it, because that'll definitely happen too. Look at this thing very carefully. Boy, that looks like a bumblebee. Maybe some of you are expert naturalists. You don't need to, you know what that is. But, to my kids, or, most people who don't have a head full of this kind of trivia and mundane knowledge, that looks like a bumblebee. Yet it's a fly. That's right. It's a syrphid fly, I believe. I'm not sure about particular, but it mimics a bumblebee. And there's a whole lot of things like that in the world that mimic bumblebees. Now, that's a bumblebee. That is a Bombus rufocinctus, the red-belted bumblebee, some call it. You can see why it would get that name, because it has very strong red patterning there. And this is a male, which means the ends of the antenna are a little bit clubbed, and it has yellow on the face. This species, you will see this thing a lot. They can be very tiny. They are very diverse in appearance and cryptic. They look, several of their morphs and different casts look like other things. It's a very interesting bee. It used to be more widely distributed in the state. There are Champaign County records, I believe, but we don't see it very often. But it has, up where you are, it is quite common. And here's maybe a little bit more of a challenge. That's a fly, but boy, doesn't that look like a bumblebee. We can look at the antenna, though. This is an aerostate antenna. It is like a plume of a feather, and bumblebees have these very obvious, thick, cord-like antennal structures. This is, that might be my picture, my hand, I'm not sure, my son's, but we were backpacking in the Smokies and walking down the trail on the river, and just kept him with us for quite some time. I forget the name of this thing, but it is associated with bumblebees. The larvae are nest inquilines. They'll lay their eggs in the nest of bumblebees, and the larvae like to eat the wax and frass and things like that are in the nest. So there's a whole lot of things that rely on bumblebees in order to make their own living, and some of them look like bumblebees. Well, what is a bumblebee? Depends, right? Well, there's 3 different castes. These are, there's 2 sexes and 3 castes. There's queens, which can reproduce sexually, and workers, which generally don't, but can reproduce asexually, and then males. And some people like to use drones to talk about them, and some people don't. You do that, I won't complain about it. But they have, they live in large colonies, and the colony depends on the species and habitat, but it can be quite large. There can be 1,000 individuals in it, or maybe 100 or so. But what's interesting about this to me is every single bee in that colony came from the queen originally, and that queen has a very complex history of her own in order to get there. So we think about bumblebees are very dependent upon the success. The success of a colony is directly related to the success of individual queens when they emerge in this early spring. And then briefly, there's another group. You can't tell them apart from bumblebees. They are bumblebees, but they have been put in a different genus by some clever entomologists, and they like to fight about who's what. And so right now we all consider them bombus, but it is a subgenus, Cithrus. These are brood parasites. They invade active bumblebee nests of other species, kill the queen, and then trick all the workers to raise their own young. So there are no workers of these bees. They're only sexual forms. That's pretty cool. Some of these are the most rare bumblebees in Illinois. So here's a pictorial representation of that life cycle that I just described. And I think this does far better than my words. So one could say, where do I start on there? And my advice would be, we'll start in your season. So this time of the year, we're around here. Queens are mated. Now, every queen out there has been mated. She mated back in the fall. Then she found a hidey hole, and that could be a lot of different things, but it's probably in the ground, almost certainly in the ground. Maybe not, but in Illinois, it's maybe deep in the ground because, geez, it's cold out here. So these bumblebees solitarily seclude themselves away in a safe place until one day in the spring, when all of you are itching to get outside and hunt mushrooms and do something and blow off work, just they are too. And so you'll go out and you'll see individual queen bumblebees flying around looking for early spring nectar and pollen sources that they can use to construct these waxen cups that they fill with nectar. So a lot of this is pollen, the wax, but the fluid inside is nectar. And this is a very critical point in, because she's got no help. She's doing it all. Strong, independent bumblebee, don't need no drone at this point. And what she will do eventually is to successfully raise a few workers, and she thermoregulates their own containers. They're in this little pit here, writhing around in a nectar soup. I can't imagine what that would look like. I'd love to see it. I've only seen this from sort of the holding a dead one in my hand level. But when she's able to coerce a few of these workers into the winged stage, she's suddenly got help, and the success of the colony it's on track. The workers can lay eggs for more workers. We can start accumulating a large number. They build more of them nests. Then the queen eventually stops foraging and starts hanging around and doing nest stuff eventually. And at some point, when there has been a critical threshold of individual workers produced, and maybe it's tied to resources around the nest, and who knows, you want to really blow your mind. Think about, how does a bumblebee know what the flowers are going to be like in the place that she lays her eggs or nests in the springtime? How does she know what the flowers are going to be like in the fall? There's some evidence that they have some way of sensing that. But anyway, when they have reached a critical threshold, they generate males. Males fertilize the females, and she's mated, and she sods off and finds a hole in the ground to wait for next year. So this is the general pattern here. The males are layabouts, they're wranglers and roustabouts and rounders. They don't do nothing for the nest. They are functionally useless. They're a drag on the colony. They may never even come back after they leave. And they'll go hang around places where they can catch queens and bumblebee whistle at them and can entice them to mate, but they don't forage for the colony, and they eventually meet a solitary fate, if they are lucky, of senescing. And if they're not lucky, they form, well, it depends on how you look at luck. Anyway, they don't live any longer than, they have the shortest life cycle of all, the shortest lifespan of all the castes. Okay, so that's the thing. Different species vary a little bit in how this works. There's one species in the tropics that sort of has a continuous emergence because they don't have this seasonal pattern that we have. That's pretty cool. But even in the tropics, there's still more of a cycle with even most of the species. Rusty patch bumblebee, some people think, emerges so early that the content of the local spring wildflower ephemeral assemblage is very important for their early nesting success. And I'm not so sure about that because I've seen some of the other species out as in the snow. Like they could not be out any earlier. So maybe there's just a lot of early species and Rusty Patch is weird in some way. But anyway, bumblebee, all of them are weird, and they're not more weird than you know, they're more weird than you can know. We just know a few ways in which they are weird. One of those is if you've ever heard them in a tomato or a squash flower particularly, they make that buzzing thing that'll scare you to death if you're in the garden, you know. That buzz pollination tactic is an evolved strategy that is relation with those plants that are particularly dependent upon bumblebees to pollinate them. Cucurbit plants in particular love to be pollinated by bumblebees. They will shower nectar and pollen on bumblebees that buzz pollinate them, and so will blueberries, more than just a visitor. The way that they do this is they basically unhook their wings and boogie. And they can do that very rapidly, unhook their wings muscles and shiver. And this can raise their body temperature, but it's also used to perform buzz pollination, which is pretty cool. And in the early season, you know, in that little pictogram, the early season queens, they don't have a home. And if you've ever found a queen, like in your mulch pile in late March, you can see like what they're doing. You can probably go find bumblebee queens in your mulch pile if you go look. They'll probably be the most common ones. If you live in Rusty Patch Town, I would say don't do it because you don't know. But you know, if you're going to turn one over, but here I'm not very worried about that. Our Rusty Patch records in Champaign County are old enough to fall off the radar for the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's likely extirpated here. But anyway, they forage in cold weather, stay near flowers until they're able to find a hole, and then I mentioned that they put their tummy on the eggs and warm up the larvae by this little bald patch on their abdomen. That's so cool. I think I put this slide in here to demonstrate a few things. First of all, there are junk plants that are very valuable to bumblebees. And so we think about, oh, that's an invasive exotic plant. You know, the landscape is covered with teasel. It's awful. I hate it. Okay. I mean, I'm with you, but it's also something that you will see bumblebees on. These flowers don't have long lifespans, but there is value to them. And I believe that is a Rufus cinctus. But the shape of the flowers varies a lot. A bumblebee that wants to go forage has to confront many different forms of bumblebee flowers. Some of them are deep and narrow. Some of them are cup-like. Some of them are just not easy for some species to get to. And there is variation in the length of the tongues of bumblebee species. And then some of these guys have figured out that they can just rob the plant. They can just chew all the bottom of the base of the flower out and get all the nectar out. And that's a common thing that carpenter bees do. But anyway, a few more bits about life history here. Workers laying these unfertilized eggs generate the queens, or generate workers and can generate males. And the queens can also lay unfertilized eggs, but they keep some of their sperm throughout the season. Because at the end of that, you know, they've got to lay a batch of new queens as well as workers. And I kind of omitted that when I talked about that. But when you generate a bunch of males, you've also got to generate a bunch of queens. There seems to be some relation in that nests tend to produce one or more of one than the other. It's not a 50-50 sex ratio in the reproductives that are produced by a nest. And the way that pheromones and diet composition, all these things interact with all of this stuff is very intricate and complicated and complex. People are teasing this kind of thing out, but I have decided that I'm more interested in what happens at the individual level and not in the chemical level for that. That's just the kind of ecologist that I am. This is one of the common species that you're likely to see, the brown-belted bumblebee. It's a male, Griseocalis. And he's on, I forget what flower that is. But you could see that the whole point of this, I believe, was the difference in that flower structure with this one and the other. These stamens stick way out, and the cup here is short, so you know, bumblebees learn the way to forage on particular species, and they have preferences, and those preferences are modified by their experience. So it's not like they fly around looking for their favorite plant. They sort of encounter plants in series and make decisions about which ones they are getting the most reward from. Lots of work on this kind of foraging stuff has happened with bumblebees that's very fascinating on how they make decisions under the threats and when they have varying rewards and varying costs and all that kind of stuff. It's very interesting ecology. I mentioned this stuff, so I'm going to skip it, but tongue length varies among sort of these clades, and that there is a payoff that actually has a functional consequence when you're foraging cross purposes, when you're foraging on things that aren't really built for you to forage on. This is another Graciacalis of a worker this time. I just love that picture. I'll tell on myself here. When I first started working on bumblebees several years ago, I really didn't know much about them. I had skipped them when I did the insect orders. You know, I never, because there's so many insects, it's like, how are you going to be an expert in all of them? I had my little niche cut out. And I didn't know that later in life I'd be working on this group. So I never learned much about bumblebees. And when I started looking for rusty patch, I thought everything was a rusty patch. That's what my brain told me. And this is one of those that I was fooled by, that little brown belt. But we're going to talk about that because I'll show you some pictures how you just cannot confuse them. Nesting things about bumblebees is they like to find a hole, and that hole can be a lot of things. And it doesn't have to be natural. In fact, they may like people. There's some really interesting work that Dave Goulson has done in the United Kingdom, looking at the distance of bumblebee nests to human, and how much they use like human rock piles versus natural rock piles and stuff like that. And it looks like they prefer something. They follow people, which is kind of cool to think that bumblebees might actually prefer to live around you because you have the tendency to leave junk laying around and to plant pretty things that they can eat. So that might be a rodent burrow, rock pile, tree hole, birdhouse, mailbox, corner of a building. We sometimes get calls at the Natural History Survey. I've got these bumblebees in my garage. They stung my husband to pieces. That one's probably the American bumblebee. It tends to do that, messed up off of the ground. But nests are difficult to find. They're very hard to find. When you read the literature, it seems like the old guys really did know things that they had a better, like I do believe in the myth of the heroic ancient ones, because some of these guys would sit in a field and watch a bumblebee fly away and then follow it to its nest. I've tried that. I've tried that with tagged bumblebees that are bright red, and I just can't do it. But if you read some of the early stuff in the Natural History Survey archives, this is how they found nests. And so a lot of the early observations about bumblebee nests are what people still use to make inferences about how they should. Don't have much more to add to them for conservation management since then. I have a student, Alma. She's very good. She's a nest whisperer. She's found a number of them, but not a rusty patch nest. This is a nest. So maybe you can see it. I'll point it at you. There it is. Nothing like a yellow jacket nest or a hornet nest, except for the very mouth of it. We've turned over a few bales of hay out in some of these fields and also found nests that were just on the surface of the ground under hay or under a cover board that herpetologists use to hide snakes and things. I think I said this already, the overwintering thing. She just needs to stay warm in a place where she can be low in torpor and low energy. And this would be the kind of place that this would, I thought I'd put another picture. This is the base of a big bunch of blue stem grass. And you know that it would be good bumblebee habitat because a mouse liked it. Some sort of rodent loved this enough to be leaving his food and uneaten food and poop and stuff around in there. So that's the kind of places that we would look. I thought that I included a picture of this thing like on the side of the hill because it definitely, but you know, the problem is in good bumblebee habitat, everything looks like this. So it's not very helpful for you to go looking for overwintering bumblebees. Some species of plants are superfoods. In other words, they provide antimicrobial benefits. They provide super nutrients, these kinds of things. If you look at the Invertebrate Society for Invertebrate Conservation, the Xerces Society, they have a pretty handy bumblebee habitat guide that'll tell you how to sort of look at your particular lot and think about things that you can score it and think about ways you can improve bumblebee habitat on your properties or properties that you manage. And it has a nice section about these superfoods that you should look at. For me, Monarda, whatever, the purple one. I'll think of it in a minute. I'm completely fried my brain with bumblebee talk. Anyway, that Monarda is very good for bumblebees. They will seek it to the exclusion of all fistulosa. Thank you, Joshua. Monarda fistulosa, in the summer when that thing is blooming, you might as well not even look anywhere else for bumblebees. You will find them on other things, but it really funnels them into the landscape. So that's a great species to look for. I see in the chat here that there's a question about the basic list of flowers to include. And I would say that the Chicago Botanical Society, and I'm sorry, Jeff, I now see that you're going to ask me at the end, but I'll just cover it while I'm here. The Chicago Botanical Society has a list of species that rusty patch has been found on that you can find on the internet. But the Xerces Society Bumblebee Habitat Guide is great for doing that. Okay.
That's a good one.
So this is happy bumblebee habitat. We've got Monarda fistulosa. We've got the gray coneflower, which they will collect pollen from. There's not a lot of nectar in that one, but it is a valuable for some of the species to get pollen, which is just as important in some ways as nectar, because pollen is the wax basis. They feed pollen to the larvae, and they will also eat it on their own. And so we also see a lot of things that are going to be blooming later. You guys are better botanists than I am, but a good habitat will have a succession of available forage throughout the season. And it doesn't all have to be in the same patch, because there are very likely spring ephemerals in this wood background here that aren't going to be out here in the middle of the field. But there will be things in the field that might bloom, like strawberry and raspberry, blackberry, those things that are very important to bumblebees at certain times of the year. Apple orchards, things like that are really important just during those bottleneck points. And here's another. Clever people will notice that's the same picture I showed you earlier. I just flipped it. So these Dutchman britches here are pretty important. They're very waxy. And we were collecting bumblebee queens on these guys. This is the only plant blooming anywhere at this time of the year in this habitat. There may have been some anemones in there, but I don't usually see bumblebees on them. But this is this is early springtime, probably just before morel time. Definitely when the ramps are up out of the ground. It's a great time to be out, and you will see bumblebee queens. We try not to capture them too much in this time of the year because she's carrying the future colony inside of her, and we don't want to have any kind of impact on those things. Okay. Mm-hmm. Wow, I feel like I speed ran through that. I hope I didn't. I've still got some time there. The bumblebee species that have been observed from Illinois, I have ordered them here in the number of observations, the number of specimen records that you will find in the collection. So the most common species in the collection, we have the most specimen records of Bombus impatiens, which funnily is the common eastern bumblebee. The next one is Bombus pennsylvanicus, the American bumblebee, which 2 weeks ago, one group submitted a petition to the Fish and Wildlife Service to list as an endangered species. Now that I say that, they may have asked to delimit critical habitat for it. Either way, that was one that they're asking the Fish and Wildlife Service to put the Eye of Sauron upon. So that's weird. When you look at the second most common bumblebee in our collection is imperiled. Some of the others are ones that you will see quite frequently if you go out. Raciocalus, Bimaculatus, Auricumus are very common. You'll see them every time that you go. Vagans, possibly you will see it. It's difficult to tell. Fervidus also is quite common, and it prefers other species of plants for forage, like white clover. We find Fervidus on the junkiest things. Really, it likes the junk. So all the other bumblebees will be over there on the Monarda. You'll get a few Fervidus on the Monarda, but if you go look in the white clover where they mow the path, that's where they are. It's very strange to see that. Fraternus, I'll show you a picture of. I've only seen it a couple times. Rufus cinctus, we don't have many of them, but they are very common in the north. So that's one of the problems. An ecologist like me looks at a list like this. I want to infer something about their abundance in the state, but I can't do that because there are reasons why there are more species than here than the collection. Because people, wow, most of them are from Champaign County, if that's a surprise, in our collection. So, Citrinus we'll talk about it. Terricola is one that has been considered for listing. I've never seen it. Now, the 13th most common species out of 18 in the collection is the rusty patch bumblebee that is on the endangered species list. Isn't that interesting? It's the 13th most common. It's not the least common. There are a number of things that are more rare than it, but it is the one that's listed. So we have to think about what's going on larger than just the state of Illinois and some of those other ancillary considerations when we think about, well, who's the most rare? Who's the most endangered? These others I've never seen. I had struck one when I realized that we had updated the collection since I made this figure, and those records were bad records. They're actually from Finland, and someone got their geography all goofy. Anyway, this is a neat slide because Morrison eye has not been seen in almost 140 years in Illinois. Frigidus, we don't know where it was collected. It says Chicago, but it was collected almost 100 years ago. And then some of these others, like Terricola, number 12 there, I've never seen it, and it's probably extirpated from the state is my guess. But we don't know. There's always things for us to go look and see. And this is a trend across North America, that there are a lot of really abundant things. This is a trend in anything, right? Any taxonomic group. Some of them are really abundant, and some of them are rare. And then there's these guys. It's like, well, what are they? Who knows? Why are they data deficient? Not as many people are going out and doing quantitative bumblebee surveys as you might wish that they were. But that's 38, 40, 46 species that we have there. So Illinois has but a subset of the fauna but many of these species have very large ranges. I should have mentioned this, and I don't have a slide, but I will say, I will type it in the chat, that there's many sources for bumblebee identification, but this one is the one that I prefer because it has dichotomous keys in it that can be used to separate the species on the basis of genitalia in a microscope. And it has lots of different citations and stuff like that. It's good. It's got species range maps. And if you are less scientifically inclined and you think some of that is a waste of time to looking at, I feel you. And there are certainly resources out there that DNR and the Missouri Public Gardens and things like that have put out that make it easier to distinguish some of the species. The benefit of this one is it's North American bumblebees, so they're all in there. You can play process of elimination with your pictures or with your specimens, and there's a lot of talk about variation and stuff. Okay, let's see. So why are they in decline? Well, this is one of those things where everyone has just thrown a bunch of explanations at the wall. Some of them stick for reasons that may have nothing to do with their, the basis of that. There is some evidence that some parasites and the bumblebee diseases have been transferred from honeybees, which were not native to North America, as you all know. So there's some evidence that honeybee density is negatively correlated with bumblebee density. So they compete. I have a great slide of a honeybees attacking a bumblebee. But a great video, but I didn't figure out how to do all that through a Zoom call. Habitat loss, obviously, it's not hard to see driving through central Illinois that there's nothing left of what the glorious thing that was here, and that would certainly have an effect on on the bumblebees that are here. But also, there are some really scary videos on social media of people taking pictures of hundreds of dead bumblebees that were in their crepe myrtles, and suddenly the housing authority for that community or the city or whatever sprayed it with some kind of name that you can't pronounce, and lo and behold, there are now a bunch of dead bumblebees underneath that tree. That's probably a problem larger than bumblebees. These certain kinds of insecticides are probably having massive effects that we will not see for a long time, because there are very few people like me who are demented enough to go out and be looking, and there's not enough support for folks to really get a kind of quantified estimate of insect densities in general. And then population dynamics. Once you get rare, it becomes hard to find a mate. You often tend to find mates that are closer to you. And in bumblebees, if you mate with consibs, if you mate with closely related individuals, it can reduce the viability of the sperm of the males and put you in this extinction vortex that's been well documented for other things that may be at play with some of the ones that we've talked about here. Okay, rusty patches used to be everywhere. This is one of the maps that was used in the petition to list it, and things have changed a whole lot since this is almost 10 years old, right? But if you look at the time, before bumblebees got hot and sexy, there weren't that many people looking for them. The white spots, the red spots, the black spots, those are where people were looking. There's a lot of gray on that map, right? So there weren't that many people looking. This is before everybody got a cell phone and was able to upload a picture to the internet, and that really has helped us understand where things are. But the original range was something like this black line. And why would it be there or not there? Who knows? I'm a biogeographer. I spend sleepless nights thinking about that exact question, like why there and why not there? What is, we will never know. I can't wait to someday get to sit down with the big guy and ask those kinds of questions, I hope, because there must be a reason, but maybe there's not. Maybe this is all a lot of random stuff. But at the very least, there were some records of them here, and citizen science are people like y'all that could go out and take pictures of things and submit them to websites and to groups that are doing monitoring. That's pretty cool. Well, if you look, I'm going to go back and forth a little bit so that you can see here. That's kind of the same, right? Kind of the same shape. This one has a little bit more pixelation because they've used a predictive model and old specimens and stuff. But, basically this driftless area down here apparently didn't have them. The Smokies, this is where I'm from. This is heaven right here. The Smokies had them, but no one has seen them in about 17 years, I think. So it looks like they've all collapsed down here. I did my master's and undergrad at NC State in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I looked through the collection, the natural heritage program there. They had them in Wake County. There were rusty patch bumblebees in Wake County, Illinois, which now is just part of this rapidly proliferating thing that's all the way going up and down through here. There's certainly gone there. There are some recent records here in northeastern Virginia or northwestern Virginia and eastern West Virginia. A lot of those have been submitted from citizen science groups who are trying to get in the way of a permit to put a pipeline through national forests. So they actually found some there. It's remarkable. There's this big gap here. Where are they? There's some on Cape Cod. That's cool. But, there's just large areas where they are not. And they weren't so much there. Pre-2006 they were, right? These are dense records. And now we look, this is records in the last 10 years on the Fish and Wildlife Service map. They're definitely collapsed. But take heart, because in Illinois, they are doing quite well, in northern Illinois. Now, these two populations, I believe, will expire this year. No one's found them, but those are properties, tracts near that the university owns here in Champaign. I look for them a lot. I've given up because I'm going to see them a lot up here. And the Fox River is great because it is sort of the home to the most dense network of known localities left in the state, and that's cool. And maybe the Fox River is a flight corridor. We don't know much about how they disperse and stuff, but it's possible that is, that they're there for a reason. But there are many places, and this is several years old, so I don't know how much it's added, but I would say not much. There are 102 counties in Illinois, and 26 of them have no bumblebee specimen records whatsoever in the natural history collection. And that's remarkable, that we know so little about what was here and what is here now. You can see these are all the records. There's large areas. These sand prairie areas have nice stuff in them, but there aren't any there. As I mentioned before, most of them are from Champaign County, but there was some researchers who were working in these counties that contributed lots of observations. Most of the bumblebees, most counties have few. Well, I'll have to bend my brain to think about that. I want to show you pictures. This is the way that we sample a quadrats or an area, and we sort of take this random walk and we time it. We capture the bees and store them in these containers and we use fresh containers so we don't give them diseases, and we keep them on ice and stop at 15 minutes and we identify them. Here's Maria with a bunch of bumblebees here in Boone County this summer. And now we're going to get to the part that I know that you're all dying for. How do I actually tell these silly things apart? And I only have a few more minutes, but I didn't give you all of them. I gave you the ones that you're most likely to see and that you will be able to distinguish. And so most of these are the very common things. Most of the bumblebees you see will be the very common things. But as you go out and look more and more, you may start noticing differences in things that you thought previously were one and the same. That's a great thing about nature. That's a great thing about the world. I'll diverge for a second. Ho Chi Minh, sitting in prison, wrote a poem that makes me always teach this to my students, right? He's looking out in the landscape after the rain. He said, "Before my mind was opened, all things were varied and distinguished. After my mind was opened, all things were one and the same." But there's another couplet. "Before my mind was opened, all things were one and the same. After my mind was opened, all things were varied and distinguished." So I don't know nothing, but I can tell you that how to tell some of these things apart, always with the caveat that we are putting an artificial category onto something that is very likely not categorical. It may be within our time frame, but there are some things in here where we just scratch our heads and we don't know. And what does that mean? That's an interesting question to talk about as we eat steak after we work. So the first things you need to learn are Impatiens, Bimaculatus, Cruciacaulus, and Auricumus, and we'll talk about them. And then these later ones that you may see. You're likely to see some of those. So some of these we've never seen in our surveys. I have seen Fraternus during exploration. But the things that are important are the color of the hairs on the abdomen, the pattern on the segments. They may vary among castes, among age, among size, among geography. So a lot of these things vary, and you sort of have to get a feel for what it looks like. The colors of the hairs on the head and the face are important, and you need to be able to tell, is this a male, is this a female, that kind of thing. So Impatiens is a common eastern bumblebee. It's the most widespread one in our records. It is the hair looks like it looks like a tennis ball. That's a character I use quite frequently to help separate them. Is it fuzzy or is it well trimmed? This one's one that's well trimmed. can be very small. They can be larger. The queens can be quite large, but there's yellow hair on the head. This is a queen. But in this species, they don't really vary. This is a queen leaving the capture chamber there. And there is yellow on the first segment. And she was quite happy to get out of there. But she's large. If you see some of the workers, especially in the late season, they're quite small. Feel like there must have been something I was going to say. I guess you look at the dot here, that's typical on this species, and there's no bar, there's no transverse coloration or anything like that. Okay, bimaculatus is the two-spotted, bimaculatus, two-spotted, is the second most common one that we see, and it is a little shaggier, and also has yellow hair on the head. On the second segment, the yellow is sort of in spots. It's not covering the entire segment like it does from the others. And these are variable, and the males are really variable. The males can have lots of yellow along the body part. Like this is a male, and I used this one there from Bug Guide. That was a nice picture. You can see the male. There's yellow on the head here. There's yellow on the face, so it's a male. And then he's got this weird color patterns back here where they're just vague. There's black hair and yellow hair together. All this banding. Bimaculatus males do that. They're very cool to look at. This is one that you can grab and hold in your hand. Graciacalis, the brown-belted bumblebee, is also very common and a little bit larger. Also like a tennis ball, very clean cut. And that's the one I already showed you. You can see this brown belt here. So people often confuse this one for the rusty patch because it is a rusty patch. But if you remember, I don't know why you would if you've lived in Illinois your whole life, but a North Carolina boy like me, we had a mnemonic for how to tell coral snakes from king snakes. And it was red on black won't hurt Jack, red on yellow kill a fellow, right? In this case, brown on black, throw him back. Brown on yellow, record that fellow. That'll help you separate rusty patch from Graciacalis. Because on a rusty patch, this second segment is fully yellow here, and the brown is on top of the yellow. And you'll see in just a minute. Bombus auricumus is one of my favorites. Great big bumblebee. It's the biggest one. They have the shortest period of emergence, I think. In our data, they just seem to show up late and disappear late, which is weird. Like they'll disappear long before the flowers are gone. It's very distinctive looking. It's cryptically confused with Bombus pennsylvanicus, and I don't have a good way to tell you those apart for you without having it in hand. But this is a male. See how large the eyes are? Huge. Males tend to have big eyes because they are looking for a girlfriend, and they are very visual. They'll find a place in a tree and look for things flying around. They'll buzz you if you get near them. So this is Bombus auricumus. They're often very dark-winged. This pattern, auricumus tends to be fully yellow across, if I remember right, and Pennsylvanicus can be black. But I may have that misfiring in my brain. But anyway, this is one of the ones that you'll see quite frequently. The largest bumblebees in the field, those are Bombus auricumus. Very, very handsome bee. Bombus pennsylvanicus, on the other hand, is probably seeing it but not noticing it separate from auricumus, except the males. I don't have a good picture of them. I've looked for this picture, and it's somewhere in my archives. But the males have a red tip abdomen, which is pretty cool. So when they start making males, the ones that are all yellow and have a red tip on their butt, those are Pennsylvanicus. You start seeing those, and you makes you think, wow, have I been missing the Pennsylvanicus? Yes, you have. You've been thinking they were all auricumus. I say that because I do. Furbitus is another common one that you might see. It's the yellow bumblebee, the fuzzy yellow bumblebee. It is pretty common. In my experience, it's pretty common. And this is the one that I said likes the trash plants. We find it on white clover and on teasel and things like that. It's pretty common, but it's pretty. Look at that beautiful thing. It's all yellow. Once you've looked at a whole bunch of impatiens and in bimaculatus and stuff, you really appreciate the ones that have a little bit of color variation on them. Like this one, Rufus cinctus, the red-belted bumblebee, can be very small. It can vary even in the hairs. Like some of them look fuzzy to me. But the workers and males usually have this red color, but the workers may not. And that's, I believe the thing on the teasel was this that I was showing you. So it may look just like this and be yellow and black here. I forgot to mention one thing. Workers like this one will carry wax and the pollen here on these little pollen baskets they have, which is a scoop on their outside of their femur that they will collect all of the pollen and that's going back and going to become one of those cups in the nest. But you can see my fingerprints, that's a pretty small bumblebee. They will sting you because they're so small. It's easy to miss them. Rusty patch bumblebee, our hero, endangered species. I frequently get sent places to look for this in nice places in northern Illinois, so that's nice. You might confuse it with vagans. You might confuse it with fraternus because those two have yellow first and second segments. You might confuse it with Graciacalis because it does have brown, but the brown, again, is on black, not on yellow like it is with Aphidus. And so this is the rusty patch bumblebee. These look like two spots often. It looks separated here. That's typical. This black bar is also typical, but not necessarily that way. It might be a spot. There is yellow on the head. Is there yellow on the head? I forget. I think that the head is black and that the gans is yellow. But if you see that abdomen color there, you know that you've got a rusty patch bumblebee because it's very striking, the contrast of the brown and the yellow. And I was tempted to just show you pictures of rusty patch bumblebee the whole time. But I thought that there are so many other interesting things to look at that maybe that we would talk about the other bumblebees. But this one is, the queens don't look like this, or at least we don't think they do. I've never seen one to be certain, but the queens are probably just yellow. It depends on which book you look in. Some books say they're all yellow. Some books have them drawn here. We don't know. It would be, no one's ever seen a rusty patch nest in Illinois. There are very few observations of them in general. The guidance that Fish and Wildlife Services uses for their nesting criteria when they're thinking about how to conserve these things is from Massachusetts and was published in the 30s. Very little we know about this sort of stuff. Vagans is the half black bumblebee. It's called that because it's yellow on top and black in the back. It's a little shaggier. Yellow hair on the head. That's right. So the rusty patch will have black hair on the head. I'm glad I reminded myself there. And it can look something like a Aphinus. We didn't talk about how to look at their cheeks, but that is a category of characters that is useful to separate some of them. And this one I took in North Carolina. I thought it was a rusty patch when I first took it. I thought, oh, I found them in North Carolina. I was up on the Parkway. But I showed it to Dr. Sidney Cameron, and we concluded it's probably a Vagans. But it's interesting because this is typical in Vagans in my experience, is that there is a darker patch of coloration. Even though it's yellow, it's still there. And they're little fuzzy yellow things, and they're cute. And there have only recently been seen much in Illinois. For many years, there were no observations. Laura Anchor told me she thought they had been extirpated. And I said, wait a second, I think that we've got a few. And so I went back and looked, and sure enough, we had preserved a few and put them in the collection. So we were able to verify that with her, that these are indeed Vagans. And it's one that I believe is on the species of greatest conservation need list. The last common one you might see, depending on, especially if you're in the western part of the state, in the sand region, the Southern Plains bumblebee, Bombus fraternus. This most recent specimen of this thing is about 40 years old, but man, it's a beautiful bumblebee. And these thistles, I don't recognize this thistle. I don't know my thistles, but I think it's a native thistle. I think this was a planting intentional, and it's in one of the sand prairies in Mason County that we saw this. And I took these pictures of this guy without knowing what the heck I was looking at. And much later did I realize, hey, that's that rare one. I talked to Angela Morehouse about how to identify him. That's it. Okay. Citrinus is one of the parasites that climbs into the nest of other species and kills them and tricks them to raise her brood, and is pretty smug about it because that's the way she makes her living. And these are very variable. They are very strange bees. Sometimes we find ourselves scratching our head, and then everyone's like, wait a second, that's a citrinus. And it clicks, particularly since the females don't forage for the nest. Any female that you see that doesn't have corbicula, the pollen basket on the hind legs, is a cythrus. It's a cuckoo. It's a nest parasite, because otherwise they would have structures for capturing pollen. So I watched this old gal right here misbehave on this teasel that hadn't bloomed yet for quite a while, just thinking, what on earth am I looking at? I have no idea. And later, yes, it's a citrinus. They often have yellow on the fourth segment. So no matter what the rest of the variable pattern is, that's a consistent thing. And not many of the other species we have, especially the workers, will have that. So that's a dead giveaway, but they can be very different looking. Here's another one. This is a male. So first of all, look at the eye size there. You can't really tell because this has got shiny head, but the eye is small here. And the eye here is this great big old eye. That's because he is looking for girlfriends. And the coloration is quite different. This is another one we looked at and thought, what on earth is that beast? And then later determined from a pen specimen that was it. Okay, so some species here I have not shown because they're so rare. I've never seen them. Some people haven't seen them in 100 years. Joshua asked, where do you get supplies for capturing bees? Now I'm not going to tell you to go capture them, because most of you in the Fox River Basin are going to get in trouble for doing that. If you look on that map of the Fish and Wildlife Service Rusty Patch Bumblebee map, I think you can Google that. If you are in a place where it is yellow or red over you, then you better not go catch bumblebees. If the Fish and Wildlife Service is involved, they will give you a ticket. It's that simple. You have to be permitted, right? Now, a camera's great. And I suppose that if one happened to get in a net or something on accident, that maybe you just have to turn it loose after you take a picture of it. But it's not a good idea to make a habit of doing that, because the chances that you encounter a rusty patch bumblebee in those yellow and red areas is elevated from everywhere else. And it's very important that we don't harm even individual workers, because we just don't know how fragile they are. It looks like they're okay, but that could all change, Let's see. If I take up beekeeping as a hobby, do I need to be concerned about? Well, unfortunately, that ship has sailed long ago, and honeybees are here to stay. Yes, they can have detrimental impacts to other things, but honey is good, and people like honeybees, and they're in good educational tools. So I don't know. I think would I be concerned about that? I mean, I don't know. There's so many other things that are a problem that I would rank this pretty low on my list of stuff I'd fix were I king of the world. However, I'm not going to tell you what to do. So I think that I had a tree fall on my house a few winters ago, and it had a 6-foot long honeycomb in it. And so we got 3 gallons of honey out of that tree and a remodel of that side of the house. I was quite grateful for honeybees at that time, because we wanted to fix some of those windows anyway. And the honey was mwah. So, I would say that I know lots of beekeepers, and I don't give them a hard time about anything. Let's see. These other websites are places that you can look to bone up on your skills for looking at bumblebees on the wing. Most of those allow you to submit observations. You might have to have an account, but that's cool. The more that you take pictures of things, the more you'll get better at identifying them, and maybe you'll take pictures of things that really improve our knowledge about stuff. So I think that's where I am there. This is Glacial, or no, this is not Glacial Park. It's the other one. It doesn't matter what that is. I'll think of it later. But does anyone else have any questions? I guess thanks for the musk thistle suggestion. I suppose that's not a native one. It's weeds.
It is not a native one, and that's what I thought it looked like too.
Oh.
But obviously the bees like it.
That's a real interesting problem, isn't it? Our perspective of who should be there and who shouldn't be there is not necessarily the same as the insects that live on that landscape.
Because a lot of our other invasive species, we know that not very much uses them, and they sort of collapse the rest of the ecosystem, and then some things species seem to have adapted to, even though they're from another part of the world. Is this picture at Moraine Hill State Park?
Yes, thank you. That's the other one there. We worked in McHenry County a lot, and I couldn't remember my name there.
Yeah.
This area here, we didn't find rusty patch right here. We found them a little bit closer to the road, but when it's in Monarda, it's a fantastic place to go see bumblebees. It just goes and goes and goes and goes.
Cool. So
how to attract rusty patch bumblebees?
Plant Monarda.
I would say, yeah, plant Monarda would be number one thing. But you know, there's the thing, like, you're attracting them. Is that a benefit to them? And I would say bumblebee boxes, yes, Carrie, those are a great thing. People are finding that they just put them out in the landscape, they get filled up with things. So maybe that means, and especially in a landscape where everybody's got a real well-maintained yard and there's no junk piles, or they cut up trees that fall down, you know, that those kinds of structures are limiting. They may be. When you put out a whole bunch of bumblebee boxes and they get filled, it makes you think that there must be limiting. So I would say if you want to attract rusty patch bumblebees, then you need to attract bumblebees. And that if you attract bumblebees, then you're going to attract them also. I don't think that their biology is that different. But they do need to have some spring forage. And that is pretty critical for the other species as well. So if you have a nice tract of woods that has honeysuckle and buckthorn in it, that would be the great thing that you can do, is get rid of all that junk. Because those definitely depress, like Jeff was just saying, those depress the native plant population that is important to rusty patch bumblebees and other bumblebees, is those early spring ephemerals, pollen and wax and nectar sources. I assume that you meant bumblebee boxes for nesting and not for like tomato farms or something like that. Okay. You know, there are people in other parts of the world and other parts of North America that have expanded the range of Bombus impatiens, the eastern bumblebee, common bumblebee, a great deal into Canada, like into Manitoba, from using them as pollinators in tomato warehouses. They've crossed the Rockies doing this. And there are other species of bumblebees that have become invasive in other countries for the same process. So if you mean bumblebees that, if you think about using bumblebees to pollinate, like a lot of people want to have, my dog needs some attention, bumblebees that pollinate your blueberry bushes and things like that, then, you know, they need to have a little bit more going on than just your blueberry bushes. That's what I would say. They need to have the whole suite, the whole full regime of structural and foraging and overwintering habitat that we look for. And if you look at that Xerces Society book, bumblebee habitat thing, it has a whole lot of those different categories of habitat and how to assess them. Is this good for overwintering? Is this good for nesting? Is it good for forage year round or season round? Those are important things. If you just have Monarda and it blooms and then there's nothing else, that's, you know, it's better maybe not to have anything if it attracts them there and then they fail.
One question you might have missed had to do with, is a water source bee bath needed, and what's the easiest way to do this?
Oh, I don't know, but I don't see bumblebees at water. Maybe I have before, but I don't see them frequently. Honeybees definitely.
Yeah.
Have you seen them? Have y'all seen bumblebees taking water? They might. I never.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. I don't know if I have or not. And I know there's always debate with different groups of insects as to whether they need to take water directly or if they get all their water through
Yeah.
food. I used to work for the Fish and Wildlife Service and did a lot of work with the Heinz Emerald dragonfly, and that's a question about odonates. People have seen odonates dipping in water, but there's still a debate as to whether they're really drinking or if they get all their water through food.
Be nice if somebody could figure out a clever way to ask them.
Right, right. Some of those things are a little hard to get the answers for. I've also heard, on the little bee box things you can buy at the flower shop and whatnot, that you should spread more smaller units around than putting up a big one with lots of tubes. Because if one of those parasites or fungus gets in there and wipes them out, it wipes them all out. And if you spread them around in smaller groups, then you have a little better survival potentially.
I guess one benefit of putting bumblebee boxes out is you could observe their nest behavior. It's very hard to find them on the landscape, but if you know where they are, it's sort of, I was thinking of the connection to noodle and catfish that we did growing up. Guys would go put their tires and boxes and stuff out there, and they knew where they were. And so they didn't have to hunt for a hole. It was easy for them to go check them all. And if you had that kind of situation where you knew where the bumblebee nest was, you could make a lot of interesting observations about bumblebees. Like you could tag them and count how long it takes them to return after they forage. You might be able to get an idea of how many individuals are there. These sorts of things are basic life history questions that we just often don't know for lots of things. And if we did have some, they haven't been published in a long time. So if you're into doing that kind of thing, please get in touch with me. I'd love to figure out ways that we could work on something like that would help. Monarda is more important for the nectar, I believe. But I'm sure that, they're not going to complain about the pollen. But the nectar is very sweet. If you've ever eaten one of the flowers, you can tell. I eat so much Monarda during the foraging season. Like I don't have to eat dinner. I just eat that flower. I love it so much. In the Xerces Society section about Monarda, it tells you lots of the other benefits about Monarda, though. It is a true superfood for bumblebees. It provides them lots of benefits just beyond, regular old nectar. It's special nectar.
Okay, yeah. So looks like that was the last question.
Yes, Josh, mints are good. Mints tend to have those kinds of, be valuable to bumblebees in general. The other species of Monarda are also great. I have Monarda Diddy. I have a series of Rusty Patch collected on Monarda Didymo from the Smokies back in the 70s in my lab in the freezer. And there were lots of rare bumblebees on there, but the red one, when I was growing up, we didn't see the purple one as much as we did the red in the mountains, and there's always bumblebees on that. The riddle for the bumblebees, the Rusty Patch, would to tell Rusty Patch bumblebee from the brown-belted bumblebee. In other words, to tell Bombus affinis from Bombus graciacalis, you say brown on black, turn him back. Brown on black is graciacalis. Brown on yellow, record that fellow. Record it and send me a picture. Or send it to the Fish and Wildlife Service. That's right.
Perfect. All right. Any other? Well, that's a good takeaway. Although probably Lonicera flowers have nectar and they may use them. I don't know.
That doesn't seem to be that heavy.
Right. Well, thank you, Jason. I think it was all very informative. everybody stayed until the end, it looks like. So very good. There'll probably be some more questions that'll come up that maybe we'll send your way. As I said, recording this session, and once we get the video back from Zoom and process it, we'll put it up on the FREP YouTube channel, and I'll send you a link to it, Jason, so to make sure you get it. And then there'll be a link to it on the FREP webpage. So yeah, thank you, Jason, and thank you all. Hope that we'll see you all in March at participating in the Fox River Summit or our One Earth Film Festival, both of which are online. See our webpage, which is foxriverecosystem.org for details. And with that, we'll sign off. Everyone have a great rest of your day and rest of your week, and stay warm.
Great. Cheers.